Okay, so welcome to this short webinar about Better Annual Reports. I'm Steve Place, Senior Advisor at Community Action Network, and this is being recorded. This is a very quick overview of annual reports, and I'm going to cover sort of legal and good practice stuff. Hopefully you'll be able to go away with a few ideas, checklists, and links to examples of good practice and so on. And if you have got any questions, ask me at the end or pop them into the chat box and I'll try and cover them. So what I'm going to try and cover is, why produce one? But actually, how can it help you rather than it just being some sort of chore that you've got to do once a year? A checklist about actually what it should contain, a few ideas about how to jazz it up so it doesn't just look like a whole long bit of text, really. And as I said, there'll be a chance for Q&A. So it's that time of the year where you suddenly realize you've got to do an annual report. So it feels, oh my God, I suppose the obvious question is, well, why put yourself through all that pain? Why do you have to produce an annual report? And I guess there are some various reasons. There are some must reasons. So, reasons that you have to produce one. And it purely and simply could be that it's actually in your constitution or articles of association, that actually there might be a clause somewhere which says that you must produce an annual report. And quite typically that's then to be presented perhaps to the members at an AGM. So you just need to check probably what is in your constitution to say whether there's anything that sets out. It probably won't. It'll probably just say, once a year, produce annual report and accounts and to be presented to the members at an AGM. But, you never know. Quite often when I work with groups, I always ask them, look at your constitution, and suddenly they find that there's something there they had completely forgotten about or never realized. Then there are legally reasons that some organizations have to produce them, and that's typically going to be if you're a company, community interest company, or a charity. So company and charity law lays down that you have to produce some form of annual report. And depending what you are, there'll be rules about actually what must be in them and even how they might be laid out. That's even more so for charities, but I'll talk about that a bit later on. CICs have a fairly simple template form to complete, and companies basically very, very simple, but accountants know the rules about actually how to set those out. And then actually some of your stakeholders might require it, typically funders. Sometimes, when you get a grant or even a contract, one of the clauses might specify that actually they want to be sent an annual report and accounts at the end of each year. And they might even stipulate, that there needs to be some mention of them in that. Typically, that's something very common with lottery funding, is that in one of the conditions of grant that they will ask that they've got to be mentioned and may even detail actually how much you've been given. In terms of the charity, it's, people might ask, well, what's the point? There's an awful lot of work involved in producing it, but why do it? But it's interesting that the Charity Commission say that they get about 14 million views of their register of charities every year. And 1 million of those will be people looking at charity financial details. And to be honest, most of those may well be funders that you've made an application to, that they will actually look at your financial reports. And of those 1 million, about a third of them will actually download them. So they won't just look at them on screen. They'll actually download a copy of your annual report and accounts. And the Charity Commission accountants themselves look at about 1,000 of those a year, just spot checking, really to see that actually they are legally compliant. So, you know, it might seem sometimes, well, we go through all this pain to produce an annual report if we're a charity and we have to upload them to the Charity Commission. Well, what happens to them? Well, they are seen by a lot of people in the public realm, but also by the Charity Commission itself. But there might be some other good reasons for producing an annual report. And a big one is about promotion, internally and externally. It's a chance to document and celebrate. And, you know, it's quite interesting, I think. Sometimes people within an organization don't really know what the organization itself is doing, and particular difference that it's made. You know, particularly if you're a larger organization where you might have different teams or different individuals working on very different aspects of your organization. They don't know what X or Y is doing. And therefore an annual report can be a very good internal document for showing the difference, the work that you're doing and the difference that it's making. And that includes, you know, trustees and committee members, you know, that they actually sometimes, I know it's very true, for instance, for CAN's own trustees, that when they see the annual report, they say, wow, didn't know we did all that, or it's great. And it makes us proud to read and see it in print. But also, of course, it can be used externally for people who don't know very much about yourselves to raise your profile and support. And of course, sometimes, very often, you're going to need to have one when you do funding bids. You know, those of you who are involved in funding applications typically always have to, quite often have to attach an annual report and accounts. But I think there's also this openness and transparency view. You know, we in the voluntary and community sector, we want to do good, but we also want to be seen to be good ourselves. So openness and transparency should be a value we hold, you know, to actually, you know, tell everyone what we do, the difference we make, and actually sometimes maybe also pointing out some of the where some things have not gone the way we wanted them to go, where things have gone wrong, but that actually we're going to learn from them and do things differently. And I think if you read all the literature at the moment about people giving to charities, more and more people want to know what's done with their money. So there's more expectation from people giving money to particular charities that actually there is openness and transparency. And your annual report is a good way of doing that. You've got a document that actually, you know, you can put out there, put it on your website or send it to people who are interested, and hopefully they can see actually what you're doing and the difference you're making. Because one of the big differences about us in the voluntary and community sectors is that, you know, we exist to make a difference, not money. So that's what makes us very different from private sector. It's not about actually increasing the stash of cash that we've got in the bank account. It's about the difference we make, like feeding the community, or improving into people's idea of dance, or improving facilities for social community recreation learning on the Bearwood estate. That's what you're about. And therefore, you need to report not only the money, but also the difference you make. And charities and CICs have to. So when we talk about annual reports, it's not just your annual accounts, but it's also some written text that probably talks about the difference that that money has made. And as I said, charities and CICs have to do that. When you look at the rules about what must be in a charity annual report or a CIC annual report, they clearly ask that you sort of give a description of the difference that the work has made over the past year. So basically, actually all of you are registered charities, so that's fine. But actually, if you were a voluntary and community organisation that wasn't a registered charity, I would be saying the same sort of thing, you know, that when you do your annual report, You just don't produce figures, but you also have some written text about the difference that your work has made. So when we talk about annual reports, there are two documents involved. There's your, okay, sorry. Yeah, so your two documents are involved. So you've got your sort of figure work, numbers on the left-hand side, and then the other bit, which will be some text about the difference that the work has made. And as I said, particularly for charities and for companies, there are certain information that has to be in there. So there are two documents in one, and basically they need to complement each other. So they explain how you raised funds, how you spent them, and you want to give the reader the idea that the charity is well run and can understand how the money it receives is being spent. How, and as I said before, but quite rightly, I think more donors are looking for the link between the money that's given them and the difference that the work has made. They'll want to see that, their £10, their £1,000, their £100,000, what difference has that money made? So the report and the numbers in the accounts need to complement one another and explain how you raised the funds and spent them. It also needs to be engaging and digestible content, explaining your activities. You've got to think about the reader. When you're writing this, you don't want people to yawn and stop reading for the first 5 minutes, because actually it's not very digestible, it's not very engaging. So I know that means it's more work than sort of like just writing down a list of things that you've done, but you've got to think about the reader, put yourself in their shoes. And it should obviously clearly have detail the difference, the impact you made. Now it can be very simple, some very simple numbers, but it needs to have some sort of that makes sense to the reader about, and it's understandable to them, so they can clearly see the difference your work has made. And it should be a balanced review of your performance in the year and any lessons learned. Again, quite often we don't want to talk about our failures where things haven't gone right, but I think it is important in our sector that we show that we can learn from them and we will change. And actually, again, some funders are starting to look for that. They feel that that's the sort of one of the criteria of a well-run organization, is that actually it is learning from when things don't go as well as they were hoped to. And then the written blurby bit should have a concise summary of your finances in the year under view and a well-articulated reserves policy. Now, this is something charities have to report on, because charities must spend the money they have within a reasonable time of receiving it, because charities exist to make a difference, not to store up money for a rainy day, but actually spend it on making a difference. So if you are keeping money back in reserve, then actually as a charity, you should have a good explanation about why you're holding that money back. You may be doing it because, at Bearwood Community Centre, that you've got to pay for, pay for rewiring in 10 years' time, and therefore you need to, store away £1,000 a year to go towards that big cost, that big one-off cost when it happens. Or it might be about I don't know. It could be also that you want to spend it on a new project. For instance, maybe Dance Pavilion wants to go and do some more outreach into communities, but actually wants to save up some money to do so. So that would be written up in your reserves policy. But the reserves policy is another topic. But you should have, if you have got money in the bank, then you need to make sure that your annual report, the written bit, explains why you do so. And then, what goes along the written report is the detailed figures with any notes to explain anything about them that would help a reader understand, particularly if there's anything unusual. Quite often, for instance, organizations will have this year's compared with last year's. And if there's a big difference between them, you don't want a reader to suddenly think, oh God, why are they spending 10 times more on that than the year before? Well, put a note in the accounts to explain it, for instance, rather than them go away getting a bit worried that maybe you're trying to cook the books or something. And then you need to be clear that your written bit is going to have any of the statutory requirements that are involved in them. And I'll talk a bit more about those later on. So what are readers looking for? In a sense, an annual report is a bit of a difficult document because you're going to have a range of audiences looking for different things. So maybe have a think about actually who you think the main sorts of people are going to be reading the report, and then make sure you've got something in it that's going to answer the queries that they are possibly looking for. So I've copied this from somebody's blog about what they thought some of the different stakeholder groups might be looking for in the report. Like donors, do I like what they do? How will my money be spent? Staff, might be reading it to say, actually, am I going to have a job in a year's time? Are we a going concern? And basically, am I being taken for a ride here in terms of actually making huge surpluses and actually I haven't had a pay rise for 4 years? Similarly, volunteers might look at the annual report to feel that actually they are making a real difference, and that they're not being abused really by being taken for a ride. The media is an interesting one. Media is obviously usually looking for bad news stories. They're not necessarily looking for good news stories. So they might be looking at things like, are they spending a lot of money on administration, what they call support costs, rather than on the end beneficiaries, the people in need, or the animals, or the grounds in need. What looks odd? Is there a story here? Charity Commission might be looking at actually the quality of accounts. And later on, I'll reference a checklist that they have. As I said, they look at about 1,000 accounts a year, and they're basically looking to see how compliant they are. So remember that we make a difference. So when reporting, it's not just about bums on seats, so the Olympics, lots of people sitting on the seats, great. But actually, what difference did it make? And I'm quite cynical really at the time, for instance, the 2012 Olympics, it was thought that would be a change in the public getting involved in sports and community sports and all that jazz, that there'll be an increase in volunteering. I think looking back, I'm not quite sure that it did that at all. Great fun, that's great. And it was a good spectacle and stuff like that. But actually, did it really achieve what people set out to do? So it's not just about bums on seats. So for instance, a meteorite hitting the Earth, was it just a pretty light in the air, or did it cause the death of the dinosaurs? Okay, so one meteorite, but two very different outcomes. And I see plenty of annual reports that talk about numbers, but very little about the impact. So, so this is, I haven't looked at Pavilion Dance, but obviously you'll have metrics about the number of classes, the number of attendees coming and stuff like that. Obviously, I'd be looking at actually, well, what difference does it make? Have more people got involved in dance? Have they increased their skills and experience? Have people developed professionally? Similarly with Bearwood Community Centre, it'll be great to have those numbers about, the number of bookings that you have and the number of attendees, but actually what sort of difference has that made to people attending? Now, it is much more difficult to measure that But you can do simple things like questionnaires, getting little stories. So there's a thing about numbers versus impact. I mentioned earlier that Charity Commission have got a checklist, and this came out of them looking at a sample of annual reports a few years ago, and it actually found that just under half of all the accounts and annual reports did not meet their statutory requirements, and that percentage was bigger for smaller organisations. So it was 46% for all charities they looked at, but actually for those charities between 25,000 and 250,000, it was 63%. So when you get this presentation, there'll be the link to the Charity Commission checklist. So I would suggest that, you know, if nothing else, and you are a registered, yes, you are all registered charities, that actually you just look at this just to make sure that your annual reports is going to cut the mustard. So the written blurb for charities is usually called the Trustees Annual Report. So I've put a bit here, but this I think is good practice for those that aren't charities as well. What the Trustees Annual Report has to be produced by all registered charities, and if you're a charitable company like Dance Pavilion, I'm trying to remember what Match Mothers is Ros. Is it, are you a CIO or you're a company limited by guarantee?
Registered charity.
What, a charitable trust?
Yes.
Okay, right. So you would only have to produce the Trustees Annual Report, okay. Whereas the others would have to produce a combined Trustees Annual Report and Directors Report, which is exactly the same. It's just that you say that at the beginning, that as well as being a Trustees Annual Report, this is a report of the directors. Now, what the Charity Commission found in the past is, particularly for smaller charities, that report just seemed to be the chair's report, you know, their bit of script that they might say at the AGM, and it won't have everything in it that the Charity Commission would expect, including things like the charity objects, just copied from your constitution, but also that it needs to talk about the public benefit, the difference that the charity has made in the year gone by. One thing that does get missed by an awful lot of charities' annual reports is this statutory statement. All you have to do is copy this in somewhere into your annual report, that you've kept in mind the Charity Commission's public benefit at all the decisions that you make. And as I said, charities also must make a statement on reserves, even if it's to say, we don't have any. You've got to put something in the Trustees Annual Report about your reserves. So either saying you don't have any, or if you have, a bit of an explanation about why you are keeping those reserves rather than not spending. And as I said, there are legitimate reasons, like saving up for a particular cost in a few years' time, but it can't just be money for a rainy day. You have to have a good idea that you will spend it next year, 2 years, 10 years time. So as I said, I'll probably do a webinar about reserves policy, maybe sometime in the autumn or winter, because it's a bit of an art. So some organisations are going to need some external scrutiny. So somebody that's not linked to your organisation to look at them. So if you are a registered charity, then if your annual income is more than 25,000, you have to have an independent examination. It's a sort of very light audit. But as soon as you go over 1 million, that's probably just Pavilion Dance. Are you over 1 million?
Not quite.
Not quite.
We're just under. Sometimes we're just over.
Right. Yes.
But
okay.
we do have a full audit.
Audit anyway. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that probably makes sense because there's no, if you keep on oscillating before, you'll have to go back and do the previous year as a full audit as well.
Yeah.
So yes, it probably makes sense. Yeah, so a full audit has to be done, and there are rules about actually who can do those. Again, there's some links at the end of the presentation about the Charity Commission guidance on who an independent examiner can be. If you're very small, it can just be somebody who feels confident about figure work. They don't have to be an accountant or a qualified auditor. For instance, the charity that I'm a trustee for, our turnover is about 60,000 a year. So we have to do an independent examination, but actually we use somebody who is a statistician by profession. So obviously very used to working with numbers and spreadsheets and so on. And he's in the past, he's been the chair of governors of a primary school and also chair of finance. So he meets the criteria, the guidance criteria from the Charity Commission for an independent examination of that size. Whereas once you get to audit, it has to be a qualified accountant auditor. Audit report is needed if you're required by the charity size. Now that's very big, that's over 10.5 million. So none of us are going to bump into that category. And it's worded correctly with references made to the correct legislation. And again, the Charity Commission have templates for that. And I've got a link at the end towards it. So the accounts themselves can either be receipts and payments or accrual accounts. So receipts and payments is money in, money out. Accruals is where you have to take account of money that's owed to you and money that you owe. So it's to give a fair and true record of your finances at the end of a financial year. So if you're doing receipts and payments, you have your accounts will be made up of a receipts and payments page, and then a second page, a statement of assets and liabilities, which is actually doesn't affect your bottom line. It's just sort of a record of actually the cash that you have in the bank, and then maybe any money that's owed to you or you owe money. If you have to do accrual accounts, you have a statement of financial activities and a balance sheet, and it becomes much more detailed. I'm going to talk about these in a bit more detail in a minute. One of the things that a Charity Commission does point out is that accounts have to be internally consistent. So that actually, if you quoted one figure on one page and then the same figure on another, they actually are the same. They quite often found that there were discrepancies, and actually quite often the accounts didn't add up correctly. You know, so you had a list of figures, but actually they don't add up. So always double check that your figures do add up. And if you are a charity, then you clearly have to show the difference between unrestricted and restricted funds in terms of your income and your expenditure. So restricted funds are going to be grants and donations that have been given for a particular purpose. So most grants, so if you've been given money to run outreach dance classes on the West Howe estate, then that clearly is going to be a restricted fund. The trustees don't have the freedom to decide how to use that money. It's been given on trust. Whereas if Matchmakers has been given, you know, £10,000 by a donor because they love the work you do, then that's going to be unrestricted. So it'd be totally up to the trustees to decide how to spend it. But when you do the figure work at the end of the year, you clearly have to show amounts of between restricted and unrestricted. So very different from private sector accounts. So I talked about these two types of accounts, accrual and receipts and payments. So they have to be accrual if you are either a charitable company. Doesn't matter if you've only got £5 income, you have to do the full accrual accounts system. But for all other charities, as soon as your annual income goes over 250,000, then you have to follow this more complicated accruals business. And you have to follow the charity's SORP, which is very, very detailed about how you set out the figure work, loads of notes that go with it to explain and to drill down some of the figures, but it also details what has to be in the trustee's annual report as well. And one of the things the SORP says is you also have to show all related party transactions. So that's anyone who's any payments to trustees, including expenses, or to any connected person, so a close relative or business partner of a trustee, or to any organisation that there might be close links with. So for instance, you might have a trustee who also happens to be a trustee that you're doing some close work with, or who happens to be perhaps you get some funding from BCB Council and they happen to be also an officer of that council. So you might need to detail that in the accounts. If you're a charitable company, you have to have this, perhaps this difference, this thing, a statement of financial activities either incorporates an income and expenditure account or you have it separately. Again, that's going to be for where you're large, and you're probably going to need to talk to a financial expert about that. If you are a charity that's made up of several subsidiaries, you might do consolidated accounts, and a cash flow statement might be required depending on your size. But none of you are in that category. But they're just good things to be aware of if you ever do grow significantly. So think about, you know, as I said earlier, there might be very different types of readers reading the accounts. So you might think about actually having different versions for different stakeholders. You don't just need to have one version for everyone. You could have your official legal one, but then you could do different ones for different readers. At the end of the presentation, I'll give you a link to a very good guide produced by Charity Comms, which talks about, you know, different ways of jazzing up and thinking about your audience. But other things to put in could be graphics, and you know, to give, like, you know, little tables rather than, you know, a list of figures. And you could use that for your financials, but also you could use that maybe for any numbers that you have about users. Sprinkle it in some photos, you know, can tell 1,000 words, you know, in a photo, sprinkle it in. And the other thing is that, you know, and the work we do is sometimes quite difficult to measure when we're talking about a difference that's being made. So I quite like this little quip. It's not mine. I nicked it from somewhere. So it's no names without numbers and no numbers without names. So this is, you know, you talk about, you know, 500 people who might have used your facilities, but then what you sprinkle in might be some quotes from some of those people about actually the difference the work made. And you might want to do, you know, make that a bit bigger with like a mini case study. So it might talk about that person, their background, what their issues were when they came to you, what services they had from your organization, and then, you know, them saying the difference that those services have made to them as an individual, maybe to their family, and so on. So you know, think about sprinkling in you know, some little quotes or little pen pictures of some of your users, so it gets put some flesh on the bones about the difference that work has made. So for the childcare charity I'm part of, we do surveys with our parents, carers, but also with the children about what they like and don't like about the childcare, and we sprinkle those in, the good and the bad, in our annual report. And if you know, if it is becoming quite a tome because you've done so much, you know, and it's a big long read, then maybe think about having something at the beginning, a summary, facts at a glance. so that actually, you know, a reader that has only got about 5 minutes can quickly have a look and read and get a good feel. And they might even then be drawn in to read the full document. But as I said, you only need to do that probably if you think that, you know, your annual report's getting beyond the sort of like 10-page length. And as I said about failures, you know, charity work is difficult. Try and change the world quite a lot of the time, and that's not easy. And sometimes we need to take risks, you know, try and use ways of doing things. We don't always get it right, so we should talk more openly about what doesn't go so well. And as I said, celebrate it as a virtue and share our sharing, learning openly. I just thought I'd show you this as a way of sort of how graphics can look different. And this is a graphic from the Charity Commission website. This is CAN's accounts for last year. Not very interesting because most of our funding comes from charitable activities, and a small amount from donations. And our expenditure is all charitable. But, you know, like, for instance, the Charity Commission has just taken that from the figures that we input to them at the end of last year, and they create a simple pie chart. So something like that might jazz up and, you know, make your annual report look more interesting. So in terms of who does your annual report, well, it's typically going to be, you know, a senior person in your organization, the chair, manager, chief executive, or whatever. And it's good to have one person so that you have a single voice, but you probably ought to try and get contributions from others as well, as I say, because it's quite rare that one person does understand everything the organization does and the difference that it makes. So you could talk to staff, volunteers, to get their feeling about actually what was important in the year gone by and what has happened. You know, once you've written it, get some feedback. Maybe, if you can, somebody who doesn't know anything at all about your organization, you know, because they'll be a sort of disinterested reader. So hopefully if it engages them and clearly gives them an idea of the work that you've done in the year and the difference that it's made, then that can be valuable feedback. And obviously at some point, it's going to have to go to your board or committee. Even if it's being drafted by one person, it will be a report from all the organisation. As I said, if you're a company or a charity, it legally will be a report from the board. So it needs to go to a meeting. They need to all say they understand it and that they're happy with it. And it should be minuted that actually they have accepted it, and actually who's going to sign it on their behalf, because usually most of these reports require a signature at the end, just one signature, but actually it should be minuted who's going to sign on behalf of the board. So that's a bit of a checklist. What does it tell the reader? What have we done? Ask you these questions. You know, what have we done? Why we have done it? What was the impact? What was the difference? And then I've rephrased this, how we spent your money. So I think that's where you put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's donated some money and critically think, does this clearly tell me my money has made a difference, that it's been well spent? Okay, for some of us, there will be deadlines that we have to meet. So if you're a company, charitable company, then you have to produce both reports, you know, the annual accounts and the report within 9 months of your year end. So most people's year end is the 31st of March. So you have until the 31st of December to actually file it with Companies House. And if it's a day late, you will be fined. And they don't usually allow any excuse. So we're talking about, sorry. So usually the fine is £150. So if you're 1 minute past midnight on the 1st of January, you'll be fined 150 quid. And if you don't do it by the end of January, it goes up to 375. After 3 months, it goes to 750, and after 6 months, it's 1,500 quid. And it gets doubled if you do it the second year as well. So if you're a company, make sure you meet your deadline. The clock starts ticking. If you are also a charity, it's a bit of a pain. Their deadline is 10 months after year end. So you have a one month's grace. So all CIOs, charitably incorporated organisations, and any other charity that has more than £25,000 has to send in their annual accounts and trustees annual report within that 10 months. And you don't get fined if late, but you get red flagged. So when you go onto the register of charities, it will say that when actually they're overdue. And even when you send it in, it will say how many days they're overdue, and it'll be red flagged, and it'll be there for the next 4 to 5 years. And funders do check, and the Charity Commission does actually advise anybody giving money to a charity to check that people have sent their accounts in, to ask themselves, if they're late, what does that tell you about the quality of the charity to run itself, that it can't actually keep to those deadlines. So it's very important. And as I said, there are no excuses. The Charity Commission did look at this, and people did give some classic ones. The back of the car flew open down the motorway and all the accounts flew out the back. The dog ate the accounts, and even a treasurer dying were excuses that the Charity Commission does not accept. So they're saying that the charity trustees, it's their responsibility to make sure that the annual accounts are produced. There are some useful templates. So when you get the presentation, there'll be links here that we have a template for trustees annual report and for simple receipts and payments, which could be used by non-charities as well. There's a link to Charity Commission guidance, and they have some examples of the trustees annual report and accounts. And then if you're a CIC, there is a very simple template you have to fill in, again, with an example filled in for you. You also have these references, A Year in the Life, our guide to annual publications from the Charity Council, which is very, very good. And I think it's a very good thing to look at. You'll probably think that this is aimed at much larger charities and with, have a nice big budget for glossy, colourful things, but it has some useful things in it. The Charity Commission has some guidance, also public benefit reporting, and the CIC has a bit of guidance about what needs to be in their report as well. And if you have to do full charity accounts, then SORP is the place you have to go to. Quite a big document, but actually there is an accountancy service called who've produced this checklist, SORP checklist, which is very, very useful to, again, just do a quick check yourself. And I say it's useful for charities to do that because in my experience, actually, the paid auditor accountants sometimes don't get it right either. And the Charity Commission did find this themselves a few years ago and slapped the wrists of, the national body for auditors and accountants. Right, okay, it's over to you. I shall stop sharing. Has anybody asked any chat? Nothing in the chats? No, okay. So does anybody have anything they want to ask at this point?
One question, Steve. So we've always done a sort of text written annual report like you're talking about. And every year we say, oh, it would be great to do something a bit jazzier, a bit like what you're saying. But it's knowing when to make that step to actually make that investment to do it. E.g., is that then a good use of charitable funds to do it? I don't know if you've got any advice and guidance on perhaps when's the right time for that.
Oh, that's like how long is a piece of string, really. I think it's for any charity, it's then deciding that it's going to be an investment that will be, a good feedback, that it's worth doing, either internally or externally. If you feel, for instance, that it might help you with funding applications, or it might help with greater public donations. I know that's one of the things that the Parks Foundation you want to encourage more and more individuals to give. So that actually it might be a document that it might be quite good to spend time and effort doing so. I can't really say. I think it's going to be down to you. You know, you might need to go away, for instance, and think about, well, can we do this cheaply? You know, if you use something like Canva rather than pay for, you know, a professional designer, for instance, that might be good enough. And it might mean investing some time for someone to get some training in using something like Canva. But I think it just comes down to you have to make a judgment call.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to ask any questions? Roz seems to have left the room. But okay. All right, I know that might have been a lot to take in, but as I said, we'll be sending a copy of the recording and the presentation, and there'll be those hyperlinks there to documents and templates that might help you. And of course, you know, Can is here. You know, if you have any other follow-up queries or things you don't quite understand or want some advice, then just get in contact with me, and we'll take it from there. Okay, then.
I think those links are going to be really useful to go and have a look through and see and absorb and sort of look at those links along with the presentation and the recording and everything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That was really informative, very useful.
Good. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
good.
Well, I will stop sharing